Hello, my name is Skylar Hogan, and this is the Coral Reef Ecosystem video. Just a little bit of vocabulary before we start off to kind of explain what we're going to talk about. So, benthic is an organism that lives mostly on or in the seafloor. I believe they can come off the water or come off the seafloor, but they're just mostly on the seafloor or in it. Pelagic, it means that they're in the water column most of the time, so fish, they can swim. They're up in the water column, not on the seafloor. Plankton is an organism that can't go against the current, so they could either be too small or they just don't really move. So jellyfish, they would be plankton because they don't go against the current, they kind of just drift with it. Nekton is an organism that can go where it wants to, so your fish and whatnot, where they can go where they want to, that would be a nekton. Next slide. Okay. And then don't mind the little like ball in the corner, that's just so I can figure out where in my notes where I'm at. Alright, so a producer. A producer makes up the first trophic level. It could also be called an autotroph, and it's an organism that can produce its own energy and nutrients, usually through photosynthesis or chemosynthesis. So seagrass would be through photosynthesis, not chemosynthesis. Like all autotrophic plants, seagrass is photosynthesized. The submerged photic zone and most occur in shallow and sheltered coastal waters anchored in sand or mud bottoms. Most species undergo submarine pollination and complete their life cycle underwater. Seagrasses form dense underwater meadows, which are among the most productive ecosystems in the world. They function as important carbon sinks and provide habitats and food for a diverse marine life, comparable to that of coral reefs. And then I said that these were benthic because they are attached to the seafloor. They can't even come off the seafloor at all. Alright, so a consumer are organisms that depend on producers or other consumers to get their food, energy, and nutrition. There are many different types of consumers. The first ones are the primary consumers, which in this case is the queen conch. They're usually herbivores and eat producers. So the producers would be the plants. Alright, so the queen conch is a herbivore and resides on the bottom of the seafloor. They feed on macroalgae, seagrass, and detritus, which is an organic matter produced by the decomposition of organisms. So I could have technically said that the queen conch was a decomposer also, but in this it works as either the consumer or a decomposer. It has a benthic stage and a pelagic stage in its life cycle. This just means that the conch lives on the seafloor for part of their life, and for another part of their life, it's in the water column. As an adult, they're benthic. At roughly 5 days after a spawning event, the eggs hatch as larvae and immediately assume the pelagic lifestyle, where they feed primarily on small phytoplankton. And then as they age, between 17 and 22 days after hatching, the larvae begin their benthic lives. The larvae metamorphosize, or the larva metamorphosis is complete between 28 and 35 days after hatching, and then they will live out their lives on the seafloor. And then I did say they were nekton because they can go kind of where they want. They don't drift at all. And then the gills, these snails have gills, and that is just an adaptation that they have to help with exchange of oxygen. Alright, so this is another kind of consumer. it's like a secondary consumer. They prey on the primary consumers. They're usually carnivores, but can be omnivores as well. So for this, we have the Caribbean lobster. These lobsters the young ones feed on soft-bodied plankton, which are tiny floating plants and animals. Juveniles and adults are carnivores, preying on snails, crabs, and clams. They are nocturnal, inhabiting coral reefs, burrows, and dens during the day, and then they come out at night for food. So for in the food chain, this would be an organism that eats or preys on herbivores or other first order consumers, but is preyed upon by top predators. So it's not the top predator, but it's also not the bottom of the food chain either. And then these lobsters also have gills to help with the exchange of oxygen. And then I guess I don't need to explain it every time, but they're benthic and nectin, which means lives on the seafloor and they can go where they want. And it's a heterotroph, which means that it can't produce its own energy. It needs to eat something else for its energy. And then I forgot to say it for the queen conch, but that's also a heterotroph. Alrighty, so for the top predator, let me just find it here. So they don't have any real predators of their own. They kind of just grow up and die, and then the decomposers will then break them down, but nothing really kills them. So blacktip reef shark is also a heterotroph. It needs to eat other things to gain energy. It can't photosynthesize or chemosynthesize to get its food. Blacktip reef sharks primarily feed on reef fish, but sometimes eat crustaceans, cephalopods, and mollusks. These sharks can grow up to 6 feet long. So I have two different definitions here. So for a predator, that's just an animal that hunts other animals. But the blacktip reef shark would be the top predator because it's at the top of the food chain with no other predators of its own. It also could be called an alpha or apex predator. Alright. And then this is a decomposer. It's called a polykite worm. It's a heterotroph. It eats it eats parts of other animals that have died. They're carnivores and feed on mollusks, crustaceans, and polykite fragments, which means that cannibalism isn't uncommon between these worms. They also have gills to help with gas exchange. Alright, so our food web, it kind of starts over with seagrass. The grass will photosynthesize and create its own energy and grow. And then the queen conch will come and eat the grass and then use its energy. The lobster would then come along and eat the queen conch and use its energy, and then the blacktip shark would eat the lobster. And after the shark dies, it would fall to the bottom and these worms would break it down. And then when the worms would then break down the other animals and create energy, and then the seagrass could use what the worms made. Alright, abiotic factors that affect coral reefs. So light is one, and corals need a moderate amount of sunlight to survive. Light is rapidly absorbed by seawater and does not penetrate to great depths. If there's too little light, then the the algae will not be able to photosynthesize and create food for the corals. Too much light may cause corals to expel this algae and cause them to bleach. So light also affects the seagrass because if there is more light than usual, then they're growing, it'll speed up their growing, but then if there's too much light, then it will kill the plant. So it's good up to a point, but they can't have too much either. Alright, so depth. Reef building corals must live where there's moderate amount of light. There's a symbiotic relationship with the algae living inside their tissues, and these algae photosynthesize in order to create food and nutrients for the coral. Alright, water temperature. Corals thrive in warm waters of the tropics. They prefer a water temperature range of 16 to 34 degrees Celsius, and this range varies for corals depending on the temperature to which they have adapted. Oops, I didn't realize. Alright, and then the salinity. Corals can tolerate a salinity range of 23 to 42 parts per thousand. The average ocean salinity is 35 parts per thousand. So if you want to think about it this way, if we have 1,000 buckets of seawater, 35 of those buckets are filled with salt, and the other 965 have fresh water. Salinity also will put more stress on an organism's system because it'll be trying to get rid of all of that excess salt in the water. Alright, turbidity is the measure of clarity of the water. When there's particles in the water, this inhibits light from penetrating through the water column, and turbidity can be caused by phytoplankton, sediment runoff, pollution, etc. So the phytoplankton, if there's too much sunlight, then they can grow a lot, and then this would make the water less clear. And then corals need clear water so the light can penetrate through the water and allow the algae to photosynthesize. When there's high turbidity, light can't penetrate through the suspended particles. Additionally, corals can be smothered by sediments or particles that settle on top of the corals. Alright, nutrients. So corals prefer low nutrient water. When there's too many nutrients, this may cause algae and plankton to grow, and this would block out the light. pH. Corals prefer seawater to have a pH between 8 and 8.3, which is the standard pH of seawater. It also, the pH, if it's too high, it could affect the queen conch because their shell is made of calcium carbonate, and that would break down their shells if the pH was too high. Water movement is also important because it brings in nutrients, food, nutrients, oxygen. It could bring all that stuff in. And then it also acts as waste removal because the currents would clean the corals by carrying away waste products and sediments that promote damaging algae growth. Right. And then one thing I found was how plate tectonics relate to corals. So the formation of coral reefs near the plate boundaries is not a coincidence. The volcanic activity resulting from these plate interactions has formed island ridges as underwater platforms, and the corals have colonized. This does not apply to some locations because they have other factors that limit the growth of corals. For example, in the Atlantic, the boundary is very deep and there's not enough sunlight for the corals. And in the northern parts of the world, it's too cold for the coral, so plate boundary would help the coral, but it doesn't guarantee the growth. So I just added some maps here of divergent boundaries, and as you can see, where there's divergent boundaries, you will also commonly see coral reefs there other than in the Atlantic and in the northern parts. Oops, went back a slide.